Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I am joined by the Lyceum member Swithun Dobson. We are going to discuss in sort of give and take fashion the Hoppian distinction between monarchy and democracy, the superiority of monarchy to democracy, and how a private state embodies the best element, or a private property system as Hoppe envisions it embodies all that it's good in monarchy without any of the statist chaff that he criticizes. Um, this all sort of got started when I was hitting Swithin up on Facebook. And I knew he was a right libertarian. That's kind of why I sought him out as a Lyceum candidate. And we sort of discussed about Hoppe, because Hoppe's kind of the classic right libertarian thinker. And we had some give and take on Facebook, and we sort of thought like, well, maybe we should just hash this out in a more public venue for the benefit of all concerned. And so here we are tonight. So thank you again, Swithin, for coming on. So why don't you open up with the Hoppian position?
Okay, so first a little bit of background before I go into it. The way Hoppe sees the world is that Europe, prior to the end of the First World War, was broadly a monarchical society. And the democracy that he is criticizing is primarily the democratic states which arise after 1918, although his arguments would apply to earlier forms of democracy. But just remember that that is the primary target for his position. So what is his position? There's a few elements to it. First, the government under a monarchy is essentially what he would refer to as a private government, as opposed to a public one under democracy. This means that the monarch treats the state as his own private property, which means that he can buy and sell that property on the market if he so wishes. And this is in contrast to a president or other people who would operate within a democratic government, in that they are merely caretakers. They do not own any of their resources. They are merely users of those resources. Consequently, assuming that both parties are just self-interested, that is the monarch or the president, they have different incentive structures. To maximize the return for which could involve using capital, running the value of that capital down, say the state train system, or any other of the state assets, and also as well to increase tax revenue to increase his own power and prestige in the short term. And remember, of course, he may only be president for 8 years, say in the American context, maximally. And so that would be his major incentive. In contrast, the king owns the property of the state. It is his. So he doesn't just have the incentive of maximizing the current streams, he also cares about the capital value. In addition, because he is king for his entire life, his time horizon is going to be longer. And so consequently, his time preference is likely to be lower. That is, he is basically going to be more far-sighted. So rather than taxing very heavily for short-term gains, he would, on average, focus more on long-term gains, which will require taxation and theft, extortion, but it would be on a relatively lower level. And also, he would be intent on maintaining the capital value of any state-owned assets because he can sell them on the open market. And to help the long-term focus of the monarch, he will typically have a son who he, on average, will want to state than he inherited it, which is something that the president or the democratic leader cannot do. So Hoppe might say something like, one of the differences between monarchy and democracy is that the president treats the car like it's a rental, whereas the monarch treats it as if it's his own car. And that is, in essence, there's more to it, but that's effectively the essence of his position. And Hoppe would cite of empirical examples in the 20th century of what he considers mass democracy and universal franchise, of increases in average tax rates, the size of the government as a sort of the number of state employees as a proportion of the population. I think he cites in monarchical France, it never got over like 3%, but in France in the 1970s, it reached 15%. So his argument is that when you get to full-blown democratic states of 1918 onwards, this sort of short-termist attitude of maximizing tax revenue and state power in the short run is going to be much more accelerated than under sort of a traditional sort of European monarch. In addition, as well, the way you become empirically, the way you basically become a leader, a political leader, is basically offer free stuff to everybody, and so consequently, that becomes popular because the have-nots there tends to be more have-nots than haves, and so they want to redistribute things to them. And he cites, if you had a world democracy, the likelihood is an Indian-China coalition where the Chinese and the Indians vote for parties who go, well, the Americans and the British have too much money, let's redistribute it, which he thinks is a likely outcome if you had sort of mass world democracy, a universal franchise. There's more to it, but that's the essential elements to it.
Yeah, so I don't think I've actually specifically spelled out all my objections to Hoppe anywhere publicly, but let's look at his distinction between a private government and a public government, where the idea that, okay, yeah, a king owns all of the land. In all of this conversation, it's pretty much impossible not to bring up Russia, because I get the impression that Russia, for both socialists, private property advocates, is really where the rubber meets the road. So, for example, Richard Pipes, in his book, The History of Property, contrasts Russia to England. Now, he argues that in Russia, he agrees with Hoppe that the Tsar owned everything. But he argues that stifled capital growth, because when the Tsar owns everything, nobody owns anything. So nobody can develop property. Now, the Tsar only has the incentive to develop as much of his property as he needs to maintain his level of living and pay his dependents and pay off his supporters. So only enough for the boyars and for the court members. Beyond that, he doesn't really have an incentive to produce more. We see this observation in Weber's Capitalism and the Rise of the Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, where he says that in the late 19th century, there was a Bavarian farmer that wanted to bring in the crops before the hail came. So he increased everyone's wages. Well, they didn't work more hours. They worked fewer hours because they could make the same amount of money working fewer hours. And they just worked fewer hours. And Weber points out that that's what happens if you increase people's wages, unless there's a sort of cultural commitment to work for the sake of work. Now, Russia is notorious for sloth and indigence, and people don't want to work in Russia, so giving them an incentive not to work is a bad thing. In England and in America, it's different because of the Protestant spirit that Weber describes. So the Tsar doesn't have any incentive to develop his property beyond what he needs. Russia is analogous to the haciendas and encomiendas of Latin America. And again, as we saw, these landlords in Latin America didn't have an incentive to develop industry, complicated mechanical processes, which we saw in England, the United States, Germany, Holland, and all these other places. They just exported cash crops. In the American South, it was tobacco. In Latin America, it's sugar, and other crops, cocoa. So this, I think, is all tied up in the Lockean proviso. Now, the Lockean proviso, there is a debate within libertarians how to interpret how useful the proviso is, which essentially goes something like this: that you can only homestead as much property that it leaves at least the same opportunity for a subsequent homesteader to take. So let's say, you're out west and you homestead everything. Don't know how you do that, but let's say you could. That would violate the Lockean proviso because you really don't need all that land and you're preventing anybody else from homesteading it. So I guess you call it the Lockean trap. If you don't have that proviso, one guy owns everything, which then disincentivizes innovation. And this is exactly what we see in Russia. Now, I will meet Hoppe halfway. The management of the Tsars was better than the USSR in certain regards. For example, the Russian ruble under the Tsars, because it was tied to the gold standard, maintained its value, whereas the Soviet ruble, which was not on the gold standard, had no value by the 1990s. But it's not, even if we use a worst case scenario like the USSR, it's not even obvious that in all cases it led to a worse outcome. I mean, education in Tsarist Russia was horrible. No, most people didn't get educated at all. And even if you argue, yeah, the Soviets did it just to brainwash people, okay, true. But the literacy, if we look at the level of high IQ scientists in Russia, winning Nobel Prizes in physics, that wasn't happening under the Tsars. That was happening under the USSR. And subsequently under, the Russian Federation. So that allocation of capital of the state to produce highly skilled technicians was something we didn't really see under the Tsarist era, even though they maybe had better finances. So even if we look at Russia, I think Russia doesn't really bear out what Hoppe is indicating with public-private governments, because cerebus paribus, educated workforce is superior to an uneducated workforce because it's able to produce things more effectively in greater volume. And yet it was the Soviets that took the time to educate the peasants and not the czars or the boyars. So obviously, if the incentive structure that Hoppe describes existed in Russia, then the Tsar would have seen it within his own self-interest to increase the product output of the Russian state by educating the peasants to operate complex machinery, which he never did. So I think that's a bit to chew on there. So I'll see what your response would be to that.
Honestly, I think Hoppe's argument necessarily rests on the idea that the king owns the entirety of his area of control, as it were. Rather, his main point is the assets of the state, which aren't necessarily the same as the entirety of the country as a whole. If you were to say that the government effectively owned the entire property in the country as a whole, you essentially get to something that would be equivalent to sort of Kim Jong-il or Kim Il-sung in North Korea, rather than what Hoppe's imagining is, well, yes, it is true that the king is sort of, maybe because it's his territory, but he might not consider it the whole of the country his assets as such. They are just the assets of his sort of state, directly, as in the palaces, the various aspects of the army, other sort of buildings and infrastructure which are owned by the king. So it's not the case that he somehow considers he has rights over the miller or the baker. He cites author. I can't recall the name. That's in sort of. I think the time period here is late Middle Ages, maybe slightly early modern period. The king was considered to have his own rights as king, but they were relatively circumscribed. They weren't, he would be considered ultra stepped on the miller's territory and told him what to do in a certain way. Now, obviously, you could say this is contingent and isn't sort of and is a sort of a historical sort of customary position, which isn't directly bears on his argument. But I think if you just narrow his claim not necessarily to the country as a whole and consider that his assets as such, but rather focus on stuff that basically state employees used and kind of were considered directly owned by the state. Arguments about capital value, etc., make sense.
So
also,
ask a point of clarification here. The point I want to ask is: Are you saying that the relevant comparison would be for any given stock capital that's owned, whether it's the whole country or not, a monarch would develop it better, more efficiently than a public trust? Is that what you're saying?
If you had a choice between let's think about this. So if you had a choice, say, then between let's say, the hereditary absolute monarch who sort of in his private sense owned the entirety of the land, in comparison with let's say, majoritarian voting for the administrator of the effective sort of communist state, then yes, the claim would be that the absolute monarch of the sort of totalitarian, the monarch of the communist state, as it were, would be preferable to the presidents of the.
Okay, yeah. So within the realm of food production, yeah, I would totally agree. The Tsarist Russia never really didn't starve. There were a few famines, but famines apparently were endemic to the Soviet Union. Then, of course, there's the Great Grain Heist of 1972, where Nixon helps organize loans on the IMF to allow the Soviets to buy a lot of grain to stave off a government collapse. I mean, when you can't feed yourself, that's like peak failure. But let's put it in another area. Let's look at, say, for example, heavy industry mass production. It's not entirely obvious to me that the Tsar was a more astute investor in mass production techniques and management than the Soviet Union. So let me give you an example. The limited industry Russia had in World War I was woefully mismanaged, and they largely collapsed because the Allied powers had no convenient way of supplying them with resources. The North Sea route, I guess you could do, which was done in World War II, but was kind of prohibitively difficult. You could do Iran, as was done in World War II, but without the automobile, that makes it very difficult too, because no railroads in Iran. So, and plus the Ottoman Empire is right next door. World War II was a bit different. So Russia's effectively isolated, and it, eventually collapses in 1917. Soviet armaments production in World War II was astronomical, second only to the United States, as far as raw output of production of material resources. So if you control for a similar kind of event, an invasion by the Germans, it looks like Stalin managed it a lot better than the Tsar did.
Okay. Well, more of a general point first, and more of a specific response. Well, you could easily claim that the Tsarist monarchs maintained the capital structure of the Russian state better than the USSR, because the USSR only lasted like 86 years or less. What was it, 84 years? No, less than that, 74. I don't remember. My maths is wrong here. I might get my dates messed up, but it's around 80 years. Whereas, of course, the Tsarist regime lasted significantly longer. So, on that basis, at least if you talk about longevity and continued existence of trying to keep, then at least the Tsar wasn't as bad in maintenance of the state than with the USSR. Otherwise, the USSR wouldn't have collapsed. On a technical point, yes, you can make the claim that yes, of course, they were better militarized, etc. in the Second World War under Stalin. But then you've got contingent factors like oh dear, what's the historian called? I don't remember his name offhand.
Richard Pike, West.
No. The guy who says that all the Soviet technology was from the West.
Oh, Sutton.
Anthony Sutton.
Mm-hmm.
Anthony Sutton. So there's certainly that angle. So and also, yeah, I don't think Hoppe would ever argue that you couldn't, that certain states which are run on average badly couldn't focus on one area and have technical superiority. It's a much more general argument than that. So the question would be, if the Tsar would have continued into existence into 1918, would on average the Russian state being in a richer, on average better off situation it would have been under the USSR? Well, that would be a more Hoppian claim, and an even more Hoppian claim would be not Nicholas II Tsar, but well, if we were to play this out over a long time period with, what should we say, the average Tsar versus the average Tsar of the Soviet Union, that would be the relevant. Wouldn't deny that you could get an English example of that would be Henry VIII, who did as much as he could. Well, broke with Rome, so not bad on that front. But basically spending all the nation's wealth, expropriation of the monasteries, etc., etc. He seemed a bit of a high time preference individual. So to focus on an individual one would be to miss the point. It's so as I say, it would. Yes, it's an average claim relative to what would have pertained in a democratic government. And again, just to note, I don't remember. Carry on. My point I was going to make.
That's fine. Okay. And obviously, the USSR is the worst case example. Hoppe in Democracy, the God That Fails makes he also would include constitutional monarchies, republics, and democracies as, broadly speaking, democratic or high time preference societies. Now, this is where I think it gets a little to meet him on his own terms, on average, over a long period of time. If we look at, say, GDP of nations. Again, it's a crude measurement, and again, libertarians have their critiques of it. But nonetheless, GDP does serve some purpose in helping us conceptualize economic growth on a scale that's so large, we begin to lose touch with what we're talking about. And these are just some rough figures from Madison Contours of the World Economy, 1000 to 230 AD, Angus Madison. If we look at 1820, the GDP of the United States was roughly 12,000 US dollars. And if we look at Russia in 1820, it was 37,000 US dollars. So let's put this in perspective, okay? The United States had a population of 3 million people thereabouts. Well, that was in the revolution. Let's say 6 million by 1820. Russia at that time had just defeated Napoleon. It had a population of about 60 million. So right there, the United States has 1/3 the GDP of Russia with 1/6 of Russia's population. Now, if we look at 1870, the United States has a GDP of about $100,000. Russia has a GDP of $84,000, approximately. And at this point, Russia still has a larger population, but the United States is closing the gap. But we already are more productive than Russia. By 1913, U.S. GDP is a whopping 520,000, and Russia is 232,000. So we have twice the GDP of Russia with a comparable population of about 160 million. So and again, compared to Europe, the United States was always far more, quote, democratic within the Hoppian conception of the term democratic than any European country. And Russia was notoriously the most autocratic. And yet, on average, over time, GDP skyrockets under the United States and stagnates under Russia. Now, this measurement doesn't measure income, but we can look at the purchasing power of an American in 1913 and the purchasing power of a Russian on average in 1913, and there's no comparison. If we turn the clock back to 1820, I mean, my goodness, the Russians are still serfs. They can't buy anything. Whereas the United States, if you were middle class, you could probably buy, manufactured goods from Europe. I mean, not a lot, not all the time, but you could still afford it in a pinch. Whereas the Russian peasant doesn't have any purchasing power. Purchasing power and GDP in the United States has always been higher than Russia, on average. And the United States, according to the Hoppian conception, embodies all of these worst aspects. And in fact, we could also point to the United Kingdom, which is the point that Richard Pipes makes in his book on the history of property. The GDP of the United Kingdom in these periods. In 1820, it's essentially comparable to Russia, 36,000. In 1870, it's 100,000 to Russia's 830,000. And then in 1913, Russia has a slightly higher GDP, 232,000 versus 220,000. But that's a little deceptive because even though Russia has on paper a higher GDP than the UK was producing very sophisticated manufactured goods. Whereas Russia, as we would see, had a very difficult time feeding itself during war. So again, the UK at that time, say from 1820 to 1913, Hoppe would have considered a democracy. And yet, whether it's GDP, whether it's purchasing power, if you look at the more, quote, democratic a society is, the higher its GDP, the higher its purchasing power. The further east you go, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, it's a lot less. And I think that those are facts that one would not predict on the Hoppian conception.
The problem with your approach is you could equally say that, the richest countries in the world have large welfare states, therefore welfare states must have some form of relation to the wealth, a causative relation to the wealth in the economy. What you have to establish is what positive contribution did the the extent that the constitution was democratic, play it as a positive role in the creation of that wealth generation. That's what you would have to establish, rather than just point out that the more democratic nations had better growth. And again, you don't control aren't English, and the English aren't Russians. If you'd had a more of a less of a parliamentary system and a more of a for want of a better phrase, absolute monarchy in England, would the developments have been relatively better than it had have been? Under the Hoppian conception, you would say yes. But the way you can only answer this is by looking at what is the causative relation between the type of government and the link to the growth rates in those countries. So his claim that basically the king has more skin in the game than the presidents, etc., they still stand. The question is, given that a president or a monarch wants to say to increase their power and prestige, assuming that's the case, I still don't see how that answers his point that because that he is going to be there for a longer time period, have a longer time horizon, on average would be relatively better than everything else kept the same, except for, well, we cease to have a parliamentary government, say in England, and it's let's say the Georges or Victoria become absolute monarchs. That's the relevant comparison. And the problem is just now this is the point you won't like, which is you can't really answer this question historically. It's a theoretical one, which does not mean that it isn't meaningful. Despite being a Kantian, rereading bits of Democracy of the God That Failed, Hoppe seems a bit of a realist than his sort of epistemology would imply. But to your major point about growth rates, really what you're asking is what really caused the Industrial Revolution in England relative to other places, and say in America, Western Europe, and Russia, which is a much broader question than what Hoppe makes. I mean, it's perfectly consistent with Hoppe's position that yes, everything else being equal, Russia would have been better than England, but England had so many other non-related advantages, not directly, they faster than Russia. I mean, that's entirely consistent with Hoppe's argument. They would have been even richer if they hadn't had the parliamentary government. And of course, remember as well, which is a point I wanted to stress to begin with, Hoppe's major critique, as I say, of the democratic systems is really universal franchise. I mean, it does apply in a more limited extent to, say, earlier parliamentary systems, etc., and sort of various limited franchise republics. But as I say, the major point of critique is for the universal franchise democratic systems post 1918.
Now, as far as universal franchise, you won't get an argument from me. I think that's a foolish and silly idea. But the couple of points you raised here, let's look at one. Okay, so control for the same people rather than comparing Anglos to Russians. Okay, well, let's look at Italy. In the Middle Ages, all the economic development was happening in Venice, Genoa, Florence, Milan, not Naples and Sicily. Naples and Sicily were monarchies. I mean, it was initially run by the Eastern Roman Empire, then the Normans took over. You had the Kingdom of Sicily, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, the Kingdom of Naples, all the way down until the Italian unification of 1870. Now, there's really no economic growth happening in those countries, whereas Venice, Lombardy, Genoa, Milan, Florence, that's where all the economic development in Italy is occurring. Now, we're considering the same time frame, the Middle Ages and early modernity were considering the same people, Italians. Now, one objection might be, well, southern Italy was a crisscross roads of armies. You had the Arabs, you had the Holy Roman Empire, you have the Romans. That's true, but so was northern Italy. Northern Italy was crisscrossed by the Holy Roman Empire, the Lombard League, the French, the Spanish. So northern Italy had the same disadvantages of being a battleground as southern Italy. But northern Italy had all the economic development. Venice, Genoa, and Florence were the engines of modern capitalism, not Naples or Sicily. And all of those were, granted, limited franchise republics, but at least in Democracy of the God That Failed and in some of the ancillary literature from around that time, Hoppe tends to put them in the same family of political ideas that he calls democracy. So I would say the other problem is I don't think Hoppe was careful enough in defining his political terms. Now, again, at a certain point, you can have analysis paralysis, and political classification becomes lost in a morass of qualifications. But I do think that, broadly speaking, the classical inheritance is useful. There are three kinds of government. Each one of the rule of the one, the few, and the many. According to Aristotle, each form has a virtuous and a vicious form: monarchy, tyranny; aristocracy, oligarchy; democracy, or politeia, democracy. With Cicero, or even germinally with Aristotle, but ultimately with Cicero, we see that a mixed government has elements of all three. Now, that is what the founding fathers sought to establish in 1783, or 1787 rather, not a unlimited franchise democracy. So it's really not unlimited franchise democracy or some proto version of it versus absolute monarchy. I think that's it's a false dilemma in the sense that it unfortunately reduces the nuance of political systems to a binary system, which, again, this is not just the analysis of 1,000 cuts. This is the inherited political model we got from Aristotle, Cicero, Machiavelli, and the founding fathers. So I think we have good reasons to use this interpretive model. And if we add that level of complexity, then it's not entirely clear that monarchy is better than all contenders, even on a Hoppian standard. But then second of all, even if we control for time and race and ethnicity, northern Italy, which was more Republican, in which in Hoppe's terms would be more democratic, was more economically successful than southern Italy, which was more autocratic, both of which have the same disadvantages of being crossroads for invading armies.
Okay. Just so I'm clear on your objections, which of the Hoppian claims about the comparative incentive structures for monarchy and democracy do you think are in error? Or do you think that they are all correct, but they don't claim?
Okay, so to put into to crystallize the objections, one objection is that the claims that are made, if they were true, we would expect to see something different than what we do. That's one objection. The other objection is, when you look at monarchs throughout Europe, because that's the example Hoppe is using, Europe, not Africa, not Asia. There is no correlation with monarchy and industrial development. If anything, the further east you go in the European project, the less economically developed you are. Now, obviously, somebody could argue, well, yeah, Western Europe inherited the Roman system. Austria-Hungary and Russia didn't. Well, yes and no. I mean, by the time Christianity shows up, they have largely imported the Roman system of philosophy, government, and politics. But I don't see. Well, not only do I not see monarchs acting with these incentives, I don't think they actually have those incentives. I think because they have so much property, vis-a-vis pipes and Weber, they have no incentive to develop it because they have more than they need, and so the surplus just goes to seed.
Would you say that they had the at least the incentive to maintain the value of their property, and that a Democrat wouldn't have that incentive, or would you deny that?
Well, okay, does the monarch have an incentive to? Now, on paper, it does sound very appealing to say that, well, because the monarch is going to have kids and his heir is going to inherit the kingdom, he's going to have a strong incentive to uh, take care of that estate so that he can inherit it to his children. But you see, I think this is based on a fundamental misconception of what monarchy is. I had a debate with Royal Endeavor and Pragmatic Culture on roughly some of these political issues. Monarchs are essentially globalists. They're a part of an international order. Almost all the kings of England were foreigners. All the Plantagenets were French. The Tudors were homegrown English. The Stuarts were Scots. And then the Hanoverians were German. So because they're not even the same people, they don't even identify with them as fellow people. And we saw this when Charles I colluded with the Irish to maintain his control in England during the Civil War. We see this with the Plantagenets, who would, well, I mean, they're French. You know, they got their Norman buddies, and they're just going to hold down England all day long. And if you look at their French holdings, like Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, and Gascony, where they did identify as Frenchmen with the French, I don't think they did a whole lot better of a job administering those than, say, the Republic of France would have done under, say, well, maybe not Robespierre, he was crazy, but, said the Second Republic after the Franco-Prussian War. So, that's actually the Third Republic. But I would say, I don't think monarchs have an incentive to increase the capital stock of their country because it's not really their country. The monarchs have all the negative incentives of rent seekers because they're foreigners. I mean, almost all the kings of England are foreigners after 1066. And in Russia, too. I mean, Peter III was German, I think. Yeah. And Catherine the Great was Danish. So they're all these foreigners. They don't have any incentive to look out for the best interests of their people. Whereas a Republican form of government, or even, if you could say the American Republic, the Constitution says you can only elect a naturalized citizen as your president. So that leader would have a in-group preference for his people, even if he's democratically elected, which monarchs have shown again and again they don't have.
Okay. Whilst they might not have, just a quick question. So, whilst they might not have the incentive to maintain the capital value of the entire country, would they have the incentive to take direct state assets?
Yeah, so what they own directly. So you can think of like Ile-de-France, owned by the French king, or the holdings of. Well, again, this is where it gets a bit ticklish, right? Because let's look at all the debt crises that the European monarchs had to suffer. Charles I, he got in trouble with Parliament because of a debt crisis. He was fighting all these wars with France and Spain. He couldn't pay for it. Now, obviously, he had direct land holdings. He was the largest landholder in England, with the possible exception of the church. And then you could also look at his nobles beneath him. But the king himself was the largest secular landholder. Now, I think Hoppe would agree with me. I think libertarians in general would agree with me that being in a state of near constant warfare is not conducive to the development of your capital stock. unless you're an arms dealer, which, I mean, obviously Charles I was not an arms dealer, and most of his estates were not dedicated to the production of military armaments, as we saw during the English Civil War, when Parliament had the upper hand in military armaments production. But we could also look at the direct land holdings of many Plantagenet rulers. They were in a state of perpetual war with France. That's not, they'd already tapped out their capital assets, which is why they had to come cap in hand to Parliament to pay for the wars in France. If they could have paid for the wars in France out of their own capital stock, they would have, because they would have then had to avoid calling up Parliament. But they ran out of money. They couldn't pay it from their own capital stock. And so I don't see any indication that the kings of England took particularly good care of improving the capital stock of their own personal holdings, given the ever-present crisis of debt crises due to their inability to pay for their endeavors.
Okay. Would you say that, let's suppose a very good historical, well, let's change historical event to a very good outcome in which Harold wins 1066 and you maintain English kings in England? Would you think that a monarch in the line of Harold in England would have been a relatively better king than a republican form of government in England?
Well, I mean, you know, being a Cromwell fanboy, I can't quite say that, but I will say that having Harold Godwinson in the House of Harold, or the House of Godwinson rather, as the kings of England, would have yielded much, much better results than the Plantagenets. First of all, there's no evidence the Godwins would have been fighting futile, pointless wars in France that literally dragged on for 300 years and killed hundreds of thousands of English and Frenchmen for literally no good purpose. That's not to say things can't change, but without having lands in France, there's no reason to believe the Godwins would have even fought the French, at least for those reasons. It's more likely the Godwins would have sought to expand into Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, which England was bound to do anyhow. Yes, I think the Godwins would have been better rulers than the Plantagenets. And, you know, before that, the house of William the Conqueror and Stephen and Matilda. But I actually think the Commonwealth was pretty well run. Now, you might argue, well, Cromwell was a de facto king and it wasn't really a republic at all. Possibly. But it is still called the Interregnum by English historians, and especially by Tories. So if we use the Tory interpretation, then no, I think that Cromwell probably did do a better job of running the government than, say, even the Godwins would have. But the Godwins would, I think, have done a better job than the Plantagenets. So you have at least the in-group preference. And it also helped that the Godwins were essentially merchants. They actually were in the business of developing property, whereas, you know, the Plantagenets were just land pirates who weren't in the business of doing anything like that.
It seems to me that you sort of recognize the Hoppian arguments. Historically, they have been what's the best way? In comparative countries, have been outweighed by other factors which were significantly more important. So even if Hoppe's case was true, that it's explanatory, the amount of impact that it could have with the explanation between let's say between the rule of the one and the rule of the few is so small as to be at best. Yes. Is that effectively your position?
I think you're getting really close to something here. Let me give an analogy to put it in another term. So when we learn, physics in college or high school, whenever we're introduced to physics, we learn that there's these four forces: the strong and weak nuclear force, the gravitational force, and I forget the fourth one right now. So I already got a bad start to this analogy. But magnetism, that's the other one. So the magnetic force is strong. So you would think that with protons and neutrons having opposite charges, they would repel each other. But the nuclear force, the strong nuclear force, is so many orders of magnitude stronger than the repulsive forces of protons and neutrons. The nuclei of the atom still holds together. And so, using that as an example, I think in-group preference based on kinsmen is like the nuclear force. And the Hoppian perspective is like magnetism. So in America, because the Constitution ensured that foreigners wouldn't run the United States, if you might argue that in the long run it would tend towards a democratic socialist state as we're approaching now, it has tended to yield better outcomes than, say, Plantagenets, Hanoverians in England did for the English, because they had no in-group preference being foreigners. I think that's probably getting close to something pretty important there.
So your point. So the Plantagenets kind of ran down their capital value because they could basically tax the common people, and they didn't care about the common folk because they were foreigners. That's a reasonable position to hold.
Just to interject real quick, the point that I want to make off that is the reason why I think, not to relitigate the U.S. Income earnings and GDP, but I think the case that I would make for why we should assume that the U.S. constitutional system is in some sense responsible is precisely because it explicitly declares that foreigners cannot run the United States. Furthermore, it also says in the Constitution that you cannot have titles of foreign nations. So, for example, the King of England was also the King of France because of Henry V. And so he had these mixed loyalties because he was also the Duke of Aquitaine. And so he had a foreign title. And so, of course, the Constitution cuts that all off. You have to be a native-born citizen. You can't have foreign titles. Because, yeah, the King of England does not want to lose Aquitaine. It's a very lucrative region to tax for wine and do other things with. So I think in that regard, now you could reasonably argue, I guess, that's not because it was a Democratic document or a Republican document. I think the case could be made that is because of that. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, so from what you were saying, it would seem like I understand that point, and I could see why you could make the argument that you had a why having a more democratic in Republican favors it treats the ruler and the nation as more closely bound than, say, some of the traditional European monarchies. This is interesting. One of the critiques that Keir Martland made of some of the Protestant sects, that they were sort of like burgeoning nationalists away from the yoke of the sort of cosmopolitan rule of the papacy. I suppose, though, in Hoppian fashion, I suppose, supposing that it was possible, would it be preferable to have had effectively a social norm that the American king could never marry well, at least his sons could never marry somebody who wasn't an American who had a lineage back a certain number of years. Would that have yielded better results in America than the sort of the partial Republican government that you had until, say, 1913?
Well, as to I'll go even one step further, given Hoppe's concept of a covenant. Yeah, it's completely plausible that a covenanted Hoppian society, private society, or a monarchy could have a written or unwritten constitution which prohibits the stakeholder from marrying outside of his kinship group. In fact, that's exactly what the book of Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy 17, requires of the kings of Israel, which they didn't do. But that's neither here nor there. So could that have happened? Yes, I think it's possible, and it could even be done in the future in a Hoppian private state. The next question is really twofold. Could that have been maintained? And if it could be maintained, would it have yielded better results? Could it have been maintained? I think is a difficult question because, as with the case of Israel, it wasn't maintained despite the best efforts of the prophets and of God himself. Also, when the king is vested with such power, if he decides to break the contract, it's difficult to imagine who could enforce it. It's like, oh, okay, the king decided to break the contract. Now, you might say, well, in a private society, everybody would be armed. That's true. But if he decides to marry a foreign woman, which then splits his loyalties potentially, would they really risk an open rebellion? I mean, we do have normalcy bias here. Is that really worth an open rebellion over? Probably not. And are there other modes of redressing it short of open rebellion? Well, that's not entirely clear. Because even if private courts were to say, yeah, you're guilty, he could just say, eat salt, pound salt, because he's the largest landholder in the region. But let's assume that could be solved. Would it have yielded better outcomes? I don't know if it would have yielded out results comparable to the United States. Yeah, like from 1787 to 1913, because if we look at the closest approximation to any sort of reactionary order in the United States, it would be the American South prior to 1861. And the American South prior to 1861 was notoriously underdeveloped vis-a-vis the North, which is why they lost the Civil War in the first place. Now, they would be more closely akin to the aristocratic element rather than a monarchical element, but they were more aristocratic than democratic. I think it's generally correct to assume the North was more democratic, the South was more aristocratic, which, even if it's not a monarchy, is closer to the Hoppian ideal. And we did not see very much economic development at all. Now, you might argue that's because of slavery. True, but all that proves is the incentives that existed were such that preserving and enforcing slavery was profitable, rather than developing it for capital use.
With the South as well, though, I mean, there's a certain sense in which, of my knowledge of relative crop yields and stuff, I mean, if the ecology was relatively easier in the South, you don't have the same incentive for technological development than you would in a relatively harsher climate. I mean, this is just a general related to the broad cold winter hypothesis of, I can't remember who developed that originally. But I think, so yeah, that's interesting. I suppose the crucial thing I think to keep into mind, to be perfectly clear as to what Hoppe's claims actually are, and I still think his claims are true. The question is empirical, as you pointed out, is how important they are and how other countervailing forces would impact them. And I think your best argument against Hoppian position is the in-group preference element does seem to be more closely associated with a concept of the government as the people in a broad sense. So I would concede that, although there's no necessary reason why you wouldn't have, you couldn't have sort of, if you compare sort of, as I said, ethnic kings of the same country, so like the Godwinsons, would have been better than the if you hold all the other literally constant theoretically, which of course that's a problem empirically, and this is Hoppe's main sort of critique of, if you look at his writings with respect to economic methodology, of the problems of regression analysis and neoclassical economics, is, well, they attempt to hold things constant, but in reality you can't actually hold everything constant. And when you attempt to hold things constant, you only hold the constant insofar as your assumptions about what would constitute constancy in an empirical analysis holds true, which in almost all circumstances is far from obviously true. So as I say, repeat, I think the broad Hoppian claims are true. I think a more interesting question is, and one you think you discussed with Keith with respect to sociology, is really what are the conditions conducive for sort of overall technological and sort of industrial progress, and then treat that as a whole, and then maybe come back to comparative government, and then see from there which factors are of major importance in a broad sociological sense, and then feed those back into more of the economic claims of comparative government. I think that would be probably the best way to approach the Hoppian argument, and to see whether or not, even if it's true, which I think on the theoretical level it still is, to what extent it matters empirically.
Yeah, so we are nearing the end of the time allotted. So I would just briefly like to summarize what I think we've agreed on, and then I'll give you the final thoughts. It seems like what we've sort of refined my objections down to are twofold. My first objection is, well, the private property incentives, I wouldn't question. I mean, Aristotle says he who owns a thing takes better care of it than he who doesn't. That's largely true. What I would argue is, I don't think it's a very prudent thing to do to equate the king or even a duke to a property owner in the kind of sense that in an abstract philosophical discussion Aristotle or Hoppe would describe a property holder. I think a different set of incentives are operating. The other critique would be that it's too narrow. There are other factors that can be as important, if not more important, such as in-group preference, which the Hoppian theory doesn't say anything about. Now, none of that's to say that a future theoretical development of the Hoppian theory can't be developed that takes these concerns into account, but only to say that as of this moment, I have not seen that. So with that, first of all, would that be fair to say that's what we've sort of established? And then your final thoughts.
Yes, I think, as I say, I would agree with you that the incentive structure of the Duke or the King is not the same as a standard individual private property owner. The question in the Hoppian position is, what is the relevant difference between the incentive structure of the Duke and the King relative to democratic caretaker? And again, our focus of the Hoppian position is the mass democratic one, which we agree on anyway. It's more of a case of relative sort of limited franchise republicanism is the interesting one. So Whereas, so yeah, the main, so I think that's true, but I still think the difference Hopper brings out between the incentives of the caretaker and the Duke is still true, even if the Dukes aren't the same as you know. So in the example of the Plantagenets, was obviously still the Duke and the King can pretty much divorce the effectively attack and not run down their capital assets. That's certainly true. It's just that Brett would do that even that group preference argument, and then you're talking about question size and other things like so I think so my final thing would be I still think Hopper's theoretical position as theoretical propositions comparative to the incentive structure keeping everything else literally constant in a theoretical sense of democracy is true. The question is empirically how much of an impact that has and whether or not on average it could retard certain aspects which are heavily correlated and causative to development, which I think your in-group preference argument is the strongest. But as you say, I think these things could be incorporated to some extent, although I'd have to think more about how that would work. But my final word would be to say that if you haven't read Hopper on Hopper at all, the best book to read is his one of his latest works, which is A Short History of Man, in which he engages some interesting sort of theoretical anthropology. His argument for the Industrial Revolution, which is basically the Cold Winter's hypothesis, and his the briefest exposition of his comparative governments and his the decline of sort of like the natural order, private property anarchism to monarchy to ultimately democracy. So if you haven't read any of him, that I think is the best distillation of his sort of comparative government works.
All right. Well, thank you, Swithun, for a stimulating conversation. This is Todd Lewis of the Phrase of Fly podcast signing off.